نحمده ونصلي ونسلم على رسوله الكريم أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا ومولانا محمد وأصحاب سيدنا ومولانا محمد وبارك وسلم صلاة وسلاما عليك يا سيدي يا رسول الله وعلى آلك وأصحابك يا سيدي يا حبيب الله. Right, so we started last week to look at some of the advice that Imam Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala has given us regarding instilling good principles and characteristics into our children. One of the things that I came across while studying for some of my talks for Muharram, which were around the topic of patience and sabr, and I picked up the Ihya of Imam Ghazali, and he's written extensively about this topic, about patience and about sabr, and just something that was very relevant to our discussion came up. And so I just want to mention that to you before moving on. And he mentions that sabr, in reality, this is something that is specific to humans. You won't find this in animals, and you won't find it that the angels show and display sabr as well. Reason being because angels, they have been created for a specific purpose, and that's to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to be obedient to Him. And so there's no element of desire or anything that would lead them away from their responsibilities. And so there isn't a need for sabr. On the other hand, with the animals, they have no restraint in that sense. There's nothing stopping them and restraining them from doing what they want. It's humans that have been given this ability, and the reason why I said it was that it's very closely related to our topic is because, if you remember last time we spoke about basic needs, human needs, and how this is where you need to begin in terms of nurturing and bringing up children. And so he mentions something under this chapter of sabr related to that. And so first of all he says that yes, humans are the ones that have been created in comparison to angels in their nature. Humans have been created weak in that they do succumb to or they can succumb to desires and so on, but then they also have to find this strength of sabr and patience within them. But he says that if you look at natural animalistic instincts, then this is something that we all need to sort of safeguard ourselves from. And he says that as a child, as a very young child, there's no sabr or no concept of patience within that child. This is what makes it remarkable about, I'm sure many of you will know, perhaps all of you will know about Sayyidina Ghaus al-Azam, Shaykh Abdul Qadir Jilani, rahmallah ta'ala, that he was born during the month of Ramadan, and he wouldn't feed during the fasting hours. That's what makes it a miracle. Because children, that's what makes it his karama, that children don't usually and aren't usually able to restrain themselves. They don't have any this power of sabr and patience has not been nurtured within them yet. And so he says that essentially there's three basic needs and requirements that a person needs to control, and that's what will help nurture and develop sabr within that person. And so he says that sabr is to, when you have two conflicting emotions, to actually choose one and to stand for the correct principle and the correct emotion. And so this is not something that either animals or to that effect even very young children, they don't have that ability within them in that age. But he says that those basic needs and desires, what are they? Food, clothing, for humans food, clothing, and the sort of carnal desires or the need and requirement to reproduce. Right? So that's something that is a natural inclination for all. And it is these things that need to be controlled right from the beginning. And it's remarkable how all of this ties together, looking at patience and sabr, how it actually ties together with this concept of nurturing from childhood. Because he says that all of these things, they need to be nurtured right from childhood, and so that they progressively get stronger. This quality of sabr and patience gets progressively stronger as the child grows older. And so that's just something briefly that I wanted to share with you, that I came across during my own personal studies, which relates to the topic that we're discussing, and is also from Imam Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala. And so this is if you remember last week we mentioned those stages. We did say that the first thing, he mentions there as well, that the first thing to actually to look at is etiquettes of food and eating and drinking. And part of that is to instill this ability of sabr. And I'll tell you why it's so important, because Imam Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala, he actually talks about the different types of sabr as well. And he says that he says sabr essentially is to restrain yourself from something. Now, the basis of this, what I find remarkable is that the basis of this is a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, in which the Prophet ﷺ said, "As-sabru nisful iman," that patience, sabr, is half of iman. Why has it been declared half of iman? Why is that? What is so important about sabr and patience that it's declared half of iman? And so Imam Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala says there's two types of patience. One is physical, and that is that you endure in times of difficulty and hardship. That's physical. So if you have some kind of problem, you endure and you're patient during that. But then you also have, so the terms that he uses is to do with the jism and the nafs, the body and the soul. So there's a sabr which is to do with the nafs, with the soul. And he says that the body is enduring difficulties, sabr and patience for the body is enduring difficulties in times of hardship. But the sabr of the soul or the inner self is to actually, when there is two choices there and there's conflicting emotions, to actually choose the right one and stand by it. And then depending on what choices you make, that sabr acquires different names. And so therefore he says that if you restrain yourself in times of difficulty, and you don't show signs of panic and screaming and wailing and all of this, this is sabr, this is patience. But if you're stopping yourself, so in essence sabr is restraining yourself. If you're restraining yourself from screaming and wailing in difficulties, this is sabr, it's patience. If you're restraining yourself from lavishing in worldly sort of desires, then that sabr is known as dhabtul nafs. It's containing your nafs and your desires. And the opposite of that is takabbur and arrogance. He says that if you're in a battlefield or in that kind of a situation where you need to show courage, to actually not run away and stand your ground and stand for what is right, is known as shuja'a. It's known as bravery, and that kind of sabr is known as shuja'a. He says that if you're actually guarding somebody's secret, to not expose that, this is sabr as well. That sabr is to restrain yourself from exposing that, is known as kitman. And if you're restraining yourself from illicit relations or desires, that is known as iffa, as chastity, that is sabr as well. So it all sort of starts to the jigsaw. You can start to put all the pieces together. Why nisf of iman? Why half of iman? Because look at all of these characteristics, like chastity, like courage, like bravery, all of these, this huge list of categories and characteristics. Imam Ghazali says that essentially these are just different types of sabr. It's just different things that you're restraining yourself from. And so instilling this characteristic of sabr within a child from an early age actually opens up the door for that child to actually develop and for you to nurture all of these characteristics within that child. It's not just sabr and patience here. It will help you to nurture all of these characteristics and much more into that child. And so that's just something that I wanted to share with you from another section of Ihya, and that's in the chapter on patience. So if you want to read around that, you can locate that in the chapter around patience. Now, coming back to our point of discussion, we started off last time and we said that, looking at children, first thing we said, we looked at nurturing a child from an early age, and Imam Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala, he said that this is responsibility of all parents to actually safeguard their children, themselves and their families from the hellfire. We began by looking at, remember, those basic needs, the first one being food, and we looked at the different etiquettes of eating, right? So eating with the right hand, saying Bismillah, eating from in front of you, and don't try to eat before others, and don't look at others, don't stare at others whilst they're eating, don't hurry in eating, and chew your food thoroughly, don't eat continuously, and don't fill all of your hands with what you're eating, and don't then also get it all over your clothes. So these are things that need to be instilled within children, and that's where we said that it's very, very important. That's why it's very, very important to have a communal family meal at least once a day, if it's if not more, and everyone needs to make that effort. About clothing, Imam Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala, he said, teach your children modesty through their clothing. Teach them to be modest and so on. And also to keep your children away from bad company. Remember that example that the Prophet ﷺ gives of good and bad company, of the good company like being in the company of a fragrance merchant, and bad company being in the company of a blacksmith in his workshop, right? Where the Prophet ﷺ explained very beautifully with that example that if you don't get a gift from the fragrance seller, if you don't buy anything from him, then at least while you're there, you will benefit from the pleasant fragrance that's emanating from his fragrances. On the other hand, if you don't get burnt in the blacksmith's workshop and your clothes don't get dirty, then whatever the case, you will still be exposed to the fumes and the smell in his workshop. So it will affect either way. That's something extremely important that Imam Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala, he says, ensure that your children do not befriend those with foul characteristics. This is extremely important because they will pick up those characteristics from them. So anyone who will expose them to lying, to jealousy, to backbiting, to tattling, fighting, arguing, just loose talk, any of these kind of things, deceptiveness. If you know that your child will be in somebody's company, will be exposed to anything like that, then you need to ensure that your child is not spending time with that person, that they are not in such company. But what's the biggest message there? Make sure you don't become that person yourself. As parents, don't expose your children to anything like that. We're not just talking about other people's company, but as parents, we have a responsibility ourselves not to expose our children to those kind of characteristics. So the first thing is to make sure that we don't display any of those characteristics. And then if you remember, he mentioned about sending to madrasa, and I think this is where we sort of ended last week's session, that when the child is of age, send the child to madrasa, teach them about deen, tell them stories of good, pious Muslims, of stories of prophets, of the Sahaba, of the awliya, of other pious people, so that they are actually, that this is a method of developing that love of the deen and those who are associated with the deen within that child. Reward the child if he displays good characteristics, reward the child and reward them publicly. Right? So commend good behavior and good characteristics, do it publicly. But now what about disciplining? I think this is where we left last time. So what about disciplining? When it comes to disciplining, he gives a 3-stage sort of sequence. He says at the first stage, if a child displays any bad characteristic or does something wrong for the first time, and even if it's within people, if the child realizes that it's done something, that he or she has done something wrong, and they try to actually conceal it or in some way perhaps make amends, or even just they try to hide and conceal it, Imam Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala, he says, if that's the first time they're displaying that kind of behavior, then allow them to conceal their shortcoming. Don't tell them off, and especially not publicly. But in fact, he actually encourages and he says, let it be. And if you can, don't even allow the child to feel that you have realized, or if you do, don't discipline the child straight away. Let them, for that one time, if you sense this realization that they have realized that it's wrong, they're trying to conceal it, let them get away with it, let them conceal it. An interesting approach, which would probably conflict with what a lot of parents would do, I think. But there's a very good logic behind it. He actually explains that logic. He said that by doing that, you will actually allow that child to develop within his or herself this their conscience, and to actually realize that what they've done is wrong, and to actually realize that they do, the importance of concealing faults and shortcomings. And so that's something, allow them to benefit from that if it's the first time. And he says that if you don't allow the child to conceal, there's a negative aspect that he highlights as well. If you don't allow the child to actually conceal that shortcoming for that time, for that moment, that may result in the child becoming courageous when it comes to doing things wrong publicly. If you make him expose it publicly, then it may, and repeatedly, most certainly, it will lead to the child actually becoming courageous in doing things that are wrong publicly. And that will be a much worse situation than the child actually acknowledging and realizing that he or she has done something wrong, and perhaps from there actually lead them towards making amends. What if the child repeats that same mistake second time? What would you do? He says if the child repeats the same mistake second time, then you need to act. Then you need to reprimand that child, but do it in solitude. Don't do it in front of others. Because again, he gives the same logic there, that if you're going to start reprimanding in public at this stage, then again it may lead to, and repeated reprimand and in public may actually, it may make that child immune to being told off. And this is something that it can be seen very, very clearly in certain situations where, if children are, for long enough, if they are exposed to something, they do become immune to it, or they become used to it. It becomes normal for them. So if shouting at your children has become a habit, then that becomes normal to them. So he says, take them to one side and discipline them alone. Explain to them the reason why what they've done is wrong. Try to get them to understand what they've done is wrong and why. That's extremely important. Because if they don't, see, this is where that hadith, and I've questioned this many times over in my mind. Sayyidina Anas bin Malik radiallahu ta'ala, he says that, narrating about his childhood with the Prophet ﷺ, he says that the Prophet ﷺ never shouted at me. He never once said to me, why did you do this, or why didn't you do this? And so I've questioned myself in my own mind many times, then, how do you discipline your children? If you never say to them, why did you do this, why didn't you do this, then how do you discipline your children? But the fact is that from there, the indication is that teach them, number one, lead by example, teach them what is correct, and then actually get them to understand why what they are doing or they are not doing is wrong. It's the realization that's important. So, get the child to actually respond and to think. And so, he says that you need to teach the child that this is something wrong. You need to teach them what's wrong about it. And you need to teach them what the result and conclusion of that will be. So for example, if it's lying, yes, it might just be, small lie or a fib. But you need to nip it in the bud. And you need to explain to the child what the result and what the conclusion of that will be. If it becomes a habit, what it will result in, not just in terms of punishment in the akhirah, but in terms of the dunya, the lack of respect that they will, the respect that they will lose in people's view, and the worldly sort of disadvantages of any habit or whatever it is that you're trying to cure as well. And then he says that don't be constantly disciplining the child as well. Because, again, as I said before, that constantly disciplining the child and constantly, for example, shouting at them and having a go at them, they'll become accustomed to this. That will become the norm. And so you're going to have to take it a step further to actually make it an act of a disciplinary act. Where are you going to go? Where is it going to end? Right? So your discipline and disciplinary action should be limited and infrequent, so that the child is aware that he or she is being disciplined. Right? So that's something to consider as well. It's very easy to get into this habit, or this is the thing about patience. It's very easy for parents to become impatient as well. It's very easy to start telling off children for all sorts of things. How many are accustomed with the child being told off for perhaps dropping something or spilling something, right? Breaking a utensil? These kind of things are not really things that you should be telling your children off for, unless obviously, I don't know, unless it's some deliberate somehow, there's something else behind it. But generally speaking, number one, if it's by accident, then accidents happen. We break things and we do things that we perhaps shouldn't do as well. And the Prophet ﷺ said, "Rufi an ummati al khata'u wan nisyan." Mistakes have been lifted from my ummah. So even we benefit from that. If you do something by mistake, entirely by mistake, but there's no intention behind it, then you can expect, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive that from us, and easy tawbah with that, or repentance with that. But the thing is, look at it from prophetic perspective as well, right? And in terms of there's narrations which mention that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, if a utensil broke, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam would say that this is the end of the lifespan of that utensil. So just like essentially, we know from prophetic teachings that just like a person has a specified lifespan, a utensil has a specified lifespan. When its life is over, somehow or other it will break. So again, here we find a lot of information from Sayyidina Anas bin Malik radiallahu anhu comes in handy, because he narrates incidents like that where the Prophet ﷺ just responded by saying, "Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un." So the answer is not oi so and so, or to use the colloquial phrases of Flanetinga. That's not the response. Right? So this is something to consider as well. Choose where your child needs. In other words, choose where the child actually needs to be disciplined, and where it's a matter to actually. Perhaps that's not a stage for disciplining, but it's a stage for actually teaching the child what to do in the aftermath of any of such kind of a situation. For example, cleaning up the mess and clearing up and so on, and giving them practical guidance from that perspective. So choose wisely as well in that sense. Choose where you need to actually reprimand the child, actually discipline them, and where you don't. So don't make it a constant habit. So that's the first thing. So the first thing was, first time. Then, if it can be done, then let the child deal with those consequences, him or herself. Right? Second time, tell them off in private. And if necessary, if it's repeated and if necessary, then maybe public reprimand. But again, that's very much discouraged, and in the sense that it can lead to even greater issues and problems. Something that Imam Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala mentions here, and I did say, before we started, that some of this advice you might find is actually very traditional. Perhaps culture and trends have changed, but I think the message is still pertinent. In that he says that the father, when talking to the child, should maintain a degree of composure all the time. Why? Because again, that same reason that reprimand should be far and between, so that the child actually realizes. And I think the situation that it's looking at here is in a situation where the father, for example, is the sole breadwinner and the mother is actually looking after the children full time. In that sense, that the mother, because the mother is spending more time with the children, there will be more occasions where, for example, they are accustomed to being told off by the mother. But for the father, look, so you see there as well how, so it could be the other way around now. They flipped the other way around, but what it's saying is that parent that is spending more time with the children, because there's more interaction there's more likelihood of the children being told off by the parent. So the other parent should maintain a degree of composure at all times, and only sort of act out or try to discipline and reprimand where and when needed. And it's for the responsibility of the parent who's spending more time with the children to actually instill this sense within those children that they should have, they should not wish to encounter that side, that nature of the other parent. Right? And so I hope that's making sense. If anything doesn't make sense, please interject and ask, raise your hand. So for example, if the mother's staying at home, then the mother should instill this sense within those children that they should have a certain degree of, now I don't want to use the word fear because it's going to be misunderstood and misrepresented, but they should have this sense where they do not, they actively do not wish to encounter reprimand or discipline from the other parent. And that will help to keep things in balance for the child as well. Start to instill certain habits within the children right from the beginning. And so Imam Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala, he says that whoever is actually responsible for that child, one thing that he should take care of is that teach the child. Obviously very young children will sleep through the night and they will nap during the day as well, but that's fine. And once they get out of that stage, teach children to sleep at night only and not to sleep during the day, because it will instill, it's a habit that develops, and it develops into laziness. So let them sleep, let them get their ample sleep during the night, and try to keep them away from sleeping during the day. And teach them to be patient when it comes to things regarding eating and drinking. And so Imam Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala, he says with regards to sleeping, eating and drinking, and clothing, teach them to adopt humility. And so if the child wishes to do he says that ensure that your child look out for the health of your child as well. This is a very strong point, in terms of make sure that your children are active and healthy. This is pretty much direct translation of what Imam Ghazali is saying to you. And look at modern concepts. Make sure that your child is active and healthy. Right? So he even says organize activities during the day where they are expected to physically exert themselves a little. Exercise. So as he says, ensure that your children have regular exercise. Make sure they are active and healthy. And this is a responsibility as a parent. And one of the reasons he says why, he says if you allow your child to become lazy and also don't teach them to be humble with their food, don't keep them active and healthy and in exercise regularly, this will just it will have a knock-on effect. It will lead to more and more problems. The child will want to eat more, will want to lounge around more. It will just keep on piling up. It will just keep on getting worse and worse. Another thing he says, don't allow your children to do something which the child believes, in terms of what he's saying is monitor what your children are doing, especially if they are wishing to do something or some activity, or if they're wishing to spend some time alone. And obviously this relates to certain ages. Right? So especially in an earlier age where the children are developing certain habits and so on, ensure that you are comfortable that your children are not doing, and you can be certain that they're not doing something wrong on their own. They need to be supervised. So another very important, make sure your children are supervised and you are aware of what they're doing, especially if they're wishing to do something alone. Because generally he says that once a child begins to develop an understanding and a conscience of what's right and wrong, then the child will only wish to, that there'll be a reason for why he wants to do something in solitude, why he wants to conduct an activity alone. And usually, or a lot of the times, you may find that the reason is because he doesn't want anybody to know about what he's doing, because it's something wrong or something that he would be ashamed of if people knew about. So, be mindful and be watchful as a parent as well for signs, for those kind of signs. At least once a day, arrange some kind of physical activity, exercise. I've mentioned that before as well, so that the child remains active and healthy. Teach the child modesty in terms of not just clothes, but also in terms of in terms of aura, what is necessary for the child to keep concealed from view of anyone any time. So teach the child from an early age. Teach the child to basically don't let them, teach them to walk calmly and perhaps gracefully. Right? Not just running around all the time, not in hyper mode all the time. Try to teach them to remain calm and walk with composure and dignity. Teach them how to conduct themselves in front of adults. Right? Teach them to show respect towards other adults. And um, this is really, you might find this interesting. Teach your children not to show off any of their father or their parents' belongings in front of other children. Teach them not to, my dad's got a Mercedes, that kind of thing. Right? So, why? Because he says ultimately this will teach your children to remain humble. And humility is a golden characteristic. So actively instill this within your children. Right? Teach them not to be boastful in front of other children of their own or their parents' belongings. And teach them to be respectful to all others. Teach them that humility is virtuous. There's this very famous Persian couplet and proverb that in Farsi, in Persian, that it is the branches that are laden with fruit that are the lowest, because of the weight of the fruit. The ones that are higher up will be inevitably empty or have less fruit. Also, says, teach your children that it is better, that hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, the upper hand is better than the lower one. That concept, he says, teach your children that it's better to be the one who gives than the one who receives. And so, in other words, try to nurture them away from greed and jealousy by doing that, by teaching them to be generous, and to give rather than to always receive. And anything that will make that child arrogant and ostentatious, keep them away from that. Right? The example he gives here is, things like silk and silver and gold and so on. Some of them may not be pertinent now, which is why I'm replacing that with anything that makes the child become ostentatious. In terms of, it might well be in the modern time gadgetry and stuff like that. Right? So teach them not to be ostentatious. Teach them etiquettes of sitting in a gathering. How are they ever going to learn that? They are going to learn that by accompanying you in different types of gatherings. Take them to different types of gatherings. Teach them how to behave in those gatherings. And so, children have a tendency, their hands tend to wander. And so some, basic habits, like in terms of, Imam Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala, he says, like spitting, cleaning their noses and things like this. Teach them the correct manner of doing this, and not to do this in public and in actual gatherings. Basically, monitor their behavior from all aspects and all perspectives. Teach them not to turn their back to somebody, and not to tread on other people's feet and toes, not to sit with their hand. Now this is an interesting one. Not to sit with their hands underneath their chins, or using their hands and wrists as a headrest. In especially what we're talking about, public gatherings or in groups here. Why? He says this is a sign of laziness. Teach them to stay away from that. In terms of teach your children how they are to speak and what they are to say in certain occasions. When in certain formal gatherings with adults, teach them to try to remain quiet and speak when spoken to, and answer questions when spoken to. Build that confidence within them. Stop them from useless, futile excessive, futile and useless talk. And anybody who you feel may expose your children to this kind of behavior, anything of what we mentioned before, keep your children away from them. Keep them out of the company of those children. And as I mentioned before, I think that first and foremost, that applies to the parents. Don't become one of those people. Don't show your child those characteristics yourself. Another interesting point, when the child comes back from madrasa, a note, it says madrasa here, not, the term that's used is madrasa, not school. Why? Because obviously now you have two separate parts which have diverged from each other. Traditionally, this would have been one path, and majority of the daytime would have been spent in madrasa, learning school and secular and religious knowledge. Here it becomes even more important. Why? Because especially if the children are going to school and they are spending several hours at school, by the time those children come back, realistically speaking, most of their energy and their, in terms of their interest in learning, has been exhausted by them. This is where it becomes important to not just send your children to a masjid, not find the one that takes the least money and teaches for the longest number of hours, and send them there for babysitting. And I say that in the politest possible manner, and I think alhamdulillah trends are changing, but this is something that I have come across, where it seems like the main concern is just for those children to be in somebody else's care for as long as possible, to free up time for personal activities or whatever. If that's the motivation behind sending your children anywhere to learn, then unfortunately you won't find it to be very fruitful. So one thing is, try to utilize the time after this, when they're in that age of going to school. Try to, and especially when they're slightly younger, when they are in primary school, in the early years, they're actually very tired when they get home. Children, be mindful of that. They after all, they are children. They are flowers and they're delicate. Don't overburden them. And so, in terms of then, if they are going to madrasa after school, then make sure that it's at a reasonable hour. Make sure they are getting back home at a reasonable hour. And Imam Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala, he says this, and this will, again, how many times have you seen the opposite of this happening in our society? He says, when the child comes back from madrasa, give him time to play. Give the child time to play, but something positive and constructive. Right? So, and not even educational. He doesn't say educational. He just says positive. Right? So, something that isn't going to instill negative and false or bad habits rather within them. There could be any game. It doesn't have to be educational. They've just spent 10 hours of the day in education. They don't need any more of that. Right? So, let them play, but ensure that it is positive and productive. Especially with electronic games and stuff now, consoles and so on, that's really important in terms that you monitor what kind of games they're playing and what the content is, and is it really suitable for them. That's something to be even more vigilant about now. But give them time to play. And it's really, really powerful. I want to translate this to you word for word, because this paragraph is really, really powerful. He says that when your children come back from school, give them time to play a good, positive game. Allow them to do this, so that their tiredness of madrasa, of school, can actually disperse. A child doesn't tire of playing. But if you stop the child from playing and don't give the child any time to play at all, and you constantly make the child learn and read, and you keep the child in education constantly, his heart will die. Those are Imam Ghazali rahimahullah's words. He says his heart will die, and his intelligence will take a shock, a hit. Again, his words. His life will become difficult, it will become harsh. Again, not my words. because of which he will then eventually give up on learning as well. And he or she will find excuses to get out of learning as well. So how, I think that's a really, really powerful statement. And that's really important, especially in, like I said, now where the children are going to school for several hours, and then after that they're going to madrasa, and then they're coming home. If they're doing that on a daily basis, you need to really balance out that routine. Says that teach the child to be respectful to parents, to teachers, to elders, and to be obedient. And allow sufficient time for play, but also teach them about the value of time, about what is when is the time to play and when it's time to actually do something else and do study or something productive. Moving onwards, as the child grows older, and if I have your permission, I might take about 5 minutes in excess of our allocated time, so I can sort of wind up this topic. We're coming towards the end of the chapter here, so I'd like to leave it at, I don't want to make an abrupt stop. I want to just sort of wind things up at a reasonable place where we can pick up next time, inshallah. So it says, as the child grows older, then teach the child to actually take responsibility for certain actions. Start teaching them requirements and demands of the Sharia and of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as well. And I think, in fact, what I'm going to do is I don't want to, we're coming up towards the end of our session now. I don't want to rush myself into finishing things in a hurry. I'll stop there. What we're moving on to next, there's still a reasonable section of this chapter left. Because up until there, it's been talking about mainly about the early years and early habits. From here, it's going to talk more about as the child begins to mature, as they start approaching the age of becoming baligh and so on, and what are the responsibilities there. There's a summary after that, and there's a very beautiful story which Imam Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala narrates about Sahal bin Abdullah rahimahullah ta'ala. And I'll just narrate the starting of this to you, leave you in a bit of suspense. If you want to hear the rest of it, come back next week. He says that I was 3 years old when I spent the night with my maternal uncle, my mamu. And I saw him get up in the middle of the night and start praying. And so during the day, he realized that the child had seen him do this. And he's only 3 years old. He says, during the day, my uncle asked me, he said, do you ever think about Allah, the one who created you? And do you ever remember him? He said, how? So the child asked, how do I remember Allah? And so his uncle said to him, before you go to sleep at night, you don't need to say anything. Just think in your mind 3 things. He said, you don't need to say it. Just think it 3 times. In your mind, in your heart, without moving your tongue. Think 3 times. Allahu ma'i, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is with me. Allahu nazirun ilayya, Allah is watching me. Allahu shahidi, Allah is my witness. These 3 things, he said, think that 3 times before you go to sleep at night, without saying anything, without moving your tongue. Allah is with me, Allah is watching me, and Allah is my witness. And it actually, this story is rather remarkable. It teaches you how this small action, where he's not even doing anything, he's not saying anything, he's not even moving his tongue, this actually shaped the entire life of this remarkable individual and this wali of Allah. I'll explain to you how next time. Any questions?